Welcome to Sweet Tea with the Classics, the podcast that takes classic literature and gives it a southern twist. Tales from Spenser, chosen from The Fairy Queen by Sophia H. MACLEHOSE. Preface. In writing these tales from the Fairy Queen, no attempt has been made to interpret their allegorical or explain their historical bearing. Intended for children, the stories are related simply as stories, and therefore only those episodes in the poem most interesting and most complete in themselves have been chosen, and in no case do the tales pretend to relate the whole that Spenser tells us of their heroes and heroines. Una and the Lion. Fairy Queen, Book 1, Cantos 1, 3, and 6. Once upon a time, while fairies and goblins still lingered in the forests of merry England, a great queen named Gloriana reigned over fairyland. The subjects over whom she ruled were not tiny creatures like Oberon and Titania, but brave knights who went out from her court endowed with magic powers to redress wrongs and to help those in trouble. Now, there lived at this time a king and queen of very ancient lineage, whose dominion stretched from east to west, who once held all the world in subjection. But a cruel enemy had risen against them, and destroyed their rich lands, and killed the inhabitants, and forced the king and queen to take refuge in a strong castle, guarded by a mighty wall of brass. This enemy was no other than a huge and fearful dragon. From every quarter of the globe knights came to fight the accursed beast, but only those with faith strong and conscience clear could prevail, and thus night after night fell before the dragon, who grew stronger and more cruel in his success. The king and queen had one child, a daughter whose name was Una. She loved her parents dearly, and hearing of the knights of Queen Gloriana, she resolved to go to the fairy court and pray for assistance for her parents, who had now been 4 years prisoners and were in great distress. She set out upon her journey, dressed in a long white black robe covered by a deep veil. She rode a donkey as white as snow, and led by a lion a milk-white lamb, a symbol of innocence. Behind her followed a dwarf, bearing a spear in his hand, and leading a warlike steed, on whose back was laid a suit of armor. Thus accoutred, Una appeared at the court of Gloriana. Shortly before, a young man, tall and powerful, but clownish in appearance, had arrived at the fairy court, and prayed to be sent on the first adventure that should arise. When therefore Una came, and preferred her request, the young man claimed the enterprise as his right. Gloriana wondered at his boldness, for he had not a knightly air, and Una herself objected, but he only urged his suit the more, and at length Una said he might try on the armor that she brought, but that unless it fitted him perfectly, it was not possible he could succeed in so dangerous an enterprise. Now the armor which Una had was that of a Christian knight, and when it was tried on, lo, the clownish youth changed into the noblest of all the company, and Queen Gloriana conferred knighthood upon him, and he, mounting the steed, led by the dwarf, went forth with Una to vanquish her foe. Henceforth the youth is called the Red Cross Knight, for on his silver shield and on the breastplate of his armor was a blood-red cross, the symbol of the Christian faith. And the knight proved right worthy of his cross. He was true and faithful both in word and deed, and his countenance was grave and sober, befitting one who dreaded no danger, but was himself held in dread. So Una loved him well. Now it happened that, shortly after Una and her knight had left the court of Gloriana, they met a grave old man, dressed in long black weeds. He had bare feet, and a hoary head, and a book hung from his side. And as he walked, he prayed and smote upon his breast in the manner of a hermit. But he was instead a wicked enchanter named Archimago, who by means of the most cunning tricks deceived the Red Cross Knight, made him think Una an impostor, and beguiled him, and also the dwarf, away from her. This made the lady very sad, for not only was she lonely and helpless in the strange land through which she was passing, but unless she could find the knight, she must give up hope of seeing the cruel dragon subdued and her dear parents set free. So Una, brave as she was good, put away her fears, and travelled on through vast forests and desolate moors, seeking for her knight. One day, almost wearied out, Una alighted from her slow-footed steed, and taking off her robe and unbinding the band which confined her hair, lay down to rest. And so fair and lovely was she, that her sweet countenance made sunshine in the shady place in which she lay. Now, while she rested, there suddenly burst out from the forest a lion, hungry and greedy, who, seeing the maiden, ran toward her with jaws wide open, ready to devour his prey. But as the lion drew nearer to the maiden, his rage changed into pity, and amazed at the fair sight before him, he forgot his savage fury, and licked her lily hands and kissed her weary feet. And Una, unable at first to cease from the fear of death, watched him, hardly believing her eyes, and then her heart began to melt in gratitude, and her tears to flow, as she thought how this fierce lord of beasts pitied her, while her own lord, whom she loved as her very life, had forsaken her. At length Una checked her tears, and trying to put away her grief, arose, and remounting her humble steed, set out again to seek her knight. But she was no longer a defenceless maiden, for with her went the lion, a strong guardian and faithful comrade, who, while she slept, kept both watch and ward, and while she walked, waited on her will, taking direction from his lady's eye. One day, as the damsel and the lion travelled thus through untrodden deserts, they unexpectedly came upon a beaten path. Following this path, which led under the brow of a steep mountain, Una observed a young girl walking slowly before them, bearing on her shoulder a water-pot. To her Una called and asked if there were any dwelling place near at hand, but the girl was rude and did not reply. Indeed, she seemed neither to hear nor understand, and when she saw the lion, fear seized upon her, and throwing down her pitcher she fled. She dared not once look back, but ran as if her life depended on her speed, until she reached her home, where sat her mother, old and blind. This was Corsica, a wicked woman and a hypocrite, who was wont daily to fast and pray, and to do painful penance. With trembling hands the girl caught hold of the old woman, and exhibited such signs of terror that her mother rose in great alarm, and hastened to close the door just as Una and her strange page arrived. Una prayed hard for admittance, but in vain, and at this the lion lifted his great paws, and tearing down the wicket door, let his lady in. She found the two women almost dead with fright, crouching in the darkest corner of the hovel. Una tried to calm their fears by gentle words and looks, and after a time succeeded so far as to receive permission to rest there for the night. She was very weary, and laid herself down on the floor, the lion at her feet, but she was too sad for the loss of the Red Cross Knight to sleep, and so she spent long hours in sighs and groans and bitter tears. At length morning approached, and with it came someone knocking at the door. He knocked loud and repeatedly, and was heard to curse and swear because the door was not more readily opened to him. Now he who knocked was a wicked thief, who robbed churches and stole money from the poor men's box. At this very moment he had on his back a heavy load of stolen goods, for all that he got, whether by lawful means or unlawful, he brought it to this old woman's house, and bestowed upon her daughter Abessa, who was as wicked as herself. There he stood at the door, but neither Abessa nor Corsica dared to pass by the lion to open. At length Kirk-Rapine, for such was his name, became quite furious, and would wait no longer, but burst open the door. Alas for Kirk-Rapine! The moment he entered, the lion rose from Una's feet, and outstretching his lordly paws, laid the robber low. The wretched man was powerless to resist, nor did Abessa or Corsica dare to go to his assistance, and very soon Kirk-Rapine lay quite dead, his body torn in pieces, and his blood flowing into the earth. Now, when the broad daylight returned, Una arose, and with her the lion, and once more set out together to seek the knight. As soon as she was gone, the women came out from their dark corner to see whether or not their worst fears were realized. When they saw that Kirk-Rapine was indeed slain, they tore their hair and beat their breasts, and half mad with malice and revenge, rushed forth in pursuit of Una. As soon as they got near her, they began to shout and cry after her, calling her all sorts of bad names, and praying that every kind of evil might befall her. At length, tired out in their own curses, they turned back, and on the way met one clad in armour as become a knight. This was, however, no knight, but Archimago, the wicked enchanter, who, not content with having separated Una from her champion, sought to lead her into further distress. He stopped the old woman, and describing Una, asked if she had seen any such lady. Thereupon Corsica's passion became renewed, and crying and cursing, she declared she knew her but too well, and told them which way to take. Before long, Archimago came where Una travelled slow, her fierce guardian treading by her side. The sight of the lion alarmed the enchanter, and he turned aside, not daring to approach too near. Now Archimago had taken care to disguise himself as Una's own Red Cross knight. When therefore she recognized the well-known shield, she turned and rode towards him, and as she approached more near, became assured in her own mind that this was indeed her lost lord. Hastening on, in much humility and with tears in her eyes, she exclaimed, "Oh, my long-lost lord, where have you been so long hidden from my sight?" The pretended knight replied that his absence had been enforced in that a certain Archimago had sent him on an adventure from which he had now returned successful, and ready henceforth to abide by her and defend her by land and sea. His words made Una very happy. In her new-found joy, she forgot the pains and toils she had encountered, and journeyed on, discoursing happily of all that had befallen her. They had not, however, travelled far when they saw an armed horseman riding towards them at full speed. Although his horse was covered with foam, the warrior kept spurring it from time to time, and looked as if he were breathing forth dread threats of vengeance on some unknown victim. On his shield the name Sansaloy was written in red letters. Now this Sansaloy was a Saracen knight, and was brother of another knight named Sansafoy. But this brother had encountered the Red Cross knight shortly after he and Una left the fairy court, and had been slain by him. The moment, therefore, that Sansaloy had seen the cross on Archimago's armor, he had determined to avenge his brother's death, and bore down fiercely on the enchanter and the lady. But Archimago had no mind to fight, and grew faint and fearful when he saw the warrior, and it was only when Una cheered him on that he ventured to couch his spear or put spurs to his horse. Sansaloy showed no mercy, but came on with such force and fierceness that his spear went right through Archimago's shield and hurtled his antagonist from his charger, so that he fell heavily on the ground, while the blood gushed from his wound. Immediately Sansaloy leapt from his steed and hastened toward his prostrate foe, exclaiming, "Lo, there the unworthy meed of him who slew Sansafoy with the bloody knife!" and thereupon began to unlace Archimago's helmet, thinking to sever his head at one stroke. But Una saw his purport and cried out, beseeching him to hold that heavy hand, urging that surely Sansaloy's revenge was enough when he saw his foe lie vanquished at his feet. To her piteous words the cruel Saracen paid no attention, but tore off the other's helmet, and would have given the fatal blow had he not perceived before him, instead of the Red Cross knight, the hoary head of Archimago, the enchanter. He stayed his hand, and gazed on the old man in amazement, for he knew him well, and knew that, skilful as Archimago was in charms and magic, he was but little used to war. "Why, Archimago," he exclaimed, "what do I see? What hard mishap is this?" The enchanter answered him never a word, but lay in a trance, apparently dying, and Sansaloy, who had no compassion in his soul, made no attempt to render him assistance. He turned instead to Una, who, poor damsel, was in sore amazement to see that he whom she had believed her own true knight was the cruel enchanter who had caused all her distress. Her wonder soon changed into terror, for Sansaloy proceeded to seize hold of her white veil and pluck her rudely from her steed, and gaze boldly in her face. But now arose the lion, her fierce servant, and full of kingly rage at seeing his lady thus maltreated, sprang upon the Saracen, and with sharp rending claws strove to tear away his shield. But Sansaloy was very strong and wary, and redeeming the shield from the lion's paws, drew his sword. Alas, the power of the wild beast was all too weak to withstand a foe armed at every point, and so mighty in strength and skill as Sansaloy. Very soon the deadly steel pierced the lion's heart, and he roared aloud, and life forsook him. Una was left alone in the hands of a cruel warrior, bereft of hope, for her faithful guardian was slain. She knew not where to look for help, and indeed help seemed very far away. The Saracen would listen to no entreaty, but lifted her to his own steed and bore her off, while the lowly donkey, who would not forsake his lady, followed as best he could. With piteous words she wept and begged for freedom, but all in vain. Her words only increased the hardness of her captor's heart. After a time, Una found herself borne into a wild forest. Here the damsel's terror became extreme, and she cried aloud in her distress, with no hope of help. But help came. Eternal providence, exceeding thought, where none appears, can make herself a way, and a wondrous way in this case it proved. Far off in the wood, A troop of fauns and satyrs, wild, untamed inhabitants of deepest forests, were dancing, whilst old Sylvanus, their god, lay sleeping. These, hearing Una's cry, left their sport and, running toward the spot from which the cry had come, appeared suddenly on the scene. They were a rude, misshapen, even frightful-looking crowd, and Sansloy, like the wicked knight that he was, seized with superstitious fears, took fright and fled. But when the satyrs beheld Una all alone, sad and desolate, her face stained with tears, they stood still before her, astonished at her beauty, and pitiful of her distress, and she, more amazed than they, began to fear and tremble afresh, for wild stories were told of the satyrs, and of their lawless deeds, and it seemed to her that a worse lot than ever before had now befallen her. So fearful was she that she dared neither speak nor move. The wild people read Una's sorrow in her sad countenance, and, laying aside the rough, frowning looks they usually wore, began to grin and smile and bend their knees before her, trying thus to comfort her. Uncertain whether or not she dared trust herself to them, Una stood irresolute, and as they watched her, were overcome by pity of her tender youth and wonder at her sovereign beauty, and prostrating themselves on the ground, kissed her feet and fawned upon her with the most kindly looks. Then Una, guessing their hearts aright, she gave herself to their care, and rising went fearlessly among them, glad as birds in the joyous springtime. They led her forth, dancing, shouting, singing, and strewing green branches before her. All the way they played on their merry pipes, until the woods rang with their echo, and worshipping the lady as a queen, they crowned her with an olive garland, and led her to Sylvanus, their god. He had wondered at the sounds of rejoicing which had roused him from his sleep, but when leaning on his cypress staff, he came forth from his bower and saw Una, he stood amazed, and wondered not when his wood-born subjects fell prostrate before her. And then came the tree-nymphs and the light-footed naiads, flocking to see the newcomer. But when they saw how fair and good she was, sharp envy seized upon them, and they fled away lest the satyrs, in their newborn reverence for Una, should scorn their ancient playmates. So Una, thankful for the favor she found and the respect shown to her, remained a long time among this forest people, and rested from her weariness. In return for their hospitality, she tried to teach them something of truth, and to prevent their worship of herself, but it was in vain, for when they found they might not worship the lady, they turned to the milk-white donkey, her lowly steed, and worshipped it in her stead. One day there came to a forest a certain Sir Satyrine, a noble knight, who had been born in these woods, and who was in the habit of revisiting them from time to time. Now when he came unexpectedly on this fair lady sitting upon the satyrs, and endeavoring to teach them true sacred lore, he wondered at her heavenly wisdom, the lack of which he had never before seen in a woman, and when he watched her courteous deeds and heard the story of her sad misfortunes, his wonder changed into admiration, and he became her scholar, and learned of her the discipline of truth and faith. Thus Una and Sir Satyrine grew close friends, and at length she told him her most secret grief, how deeply she longed to find the Red Cross Knight, and how all her secret thoughts were spent in contriving an escape from her kind but rude guardians. Sir Satyrine began to devise how he might help her, and one day while the satyrs had all gone to pay homage to Sylvanus, the strong knight led away the gentle virgin, and after further adventures, of which you shall hear in the next tale, Una did at last rejoin her long-lost knight, to the great comfort of them both. Thank you for listening to Sweet Tea with the Classics. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Please like, share, and subscribe for more.